Welcome back to World Series News, and I trust everyone has been following the news and wondering, scratching their head, when it is going to change. Well, that's the best part of watching World Series News. We're always going to be that little bit of a step ahead. Jason Q. Citizen here, and our slogan is Tomorrow's News. Can you believe it? Here we come. Simon is on the line, ready to go. And there's a lot to talk about today, particularly the massive effect Tucker Carlson's disappearance off the screens of Fox News has played. It feels like the audience, the conservative audience around the world, is rejuvenated because Tucker now gets to speak a higher truth than was ever said. And the narrative, very, very confusing, because why would Rupert Murdoch, one of the world's greatest businessmen, regardless of what you think of him, just hand over almost $800 million without contest, despite the fact that there were experts and enormous amounts of evidence? To talk about that and all the latest news from around the world, let's bring in Simon right now. Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to getting onto the show. Please like and share. It really, really does help defeat the algorithms and all of those crazy censors out there in social media land. Simon, welcome back to World Series News.
Hello there, Jason. It's a pleasure to be with you. Looking forward to banging through the issues that we've got of the day. Quite a lot going on in the Middle East and China as well, so it's going to be a busy session.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, at the bottom of the screen, I will flash up some of the headlines that we're going to talk about to get you that little bit of a step ahead. You can speed up this show as well to get through the news, but you won't get this news anywhere else. And how do we know that? Because Simon is on all sorts of news coverage all around the world. He gets 5 minutes here, 15 minutes there. And on this show, we try and get the full hour of all the details. And Simon, before we start, what's the reaction you get when you get onto these different shows from the presenters who have very, very big audiences? What's their reaction to you?
It is a little bit strange because, I'm on some shows that have over 1 million viewers now. And some that live have maybe 50 or 100,000, and then another 10 or 20,000 watches as a podcast. But there's not, I would say, an alt-right or definitely not a far-right theme to all of them. So really what I'm doing is simply presenting as much accurate information as I possibly can without any real political flavor to it. And so that's why, I literally in the same day or the following day, I might be on InfoWars, and then I'll be on with Mr. Galloway, George Galloway's show. And so everyone would obviously recognize that one of those is fairly on the right and one of those is fairly on the left. But because I'm not trying to, force my opinion onto people, then even though there's a very different listenership, people just are interested in what's happening in the world and trying to get an explanation as to why these incredible events are transpiring so fast.
It is astonishing, isn't it, the speed at which is going on, and that's why we're putting these shows together, because one, it's a chronicle, two, people need to know, but what's interesting is how the trajectory is just mapping itself out. It's almost like we can talk about today's news and point to exactly where that is headed, and no one wants to cover it, Simon, in the mainstream, possibly because they can't see it, or it's too complicated for them. Do you find that that's another thing that people are struggling with, is understanding how all these pieces come together? But really, when you break it down, it's just the US versus a brand new superpower in China, using the weakness of the US to expand the new Chinese empire.
Well, that's quite a complicated answer there. There's definitely a pushback from the Chinese point of view against the global hegemon, and they're repeatedly referring to the United States now as either the hegemonic power or the hegemonic force. The UK isn't even being mentioned by name. They're just called the Anglo-Saxons. They literally seem to be those who should not be mentioned at this present time. And so I don't think it's quite fair to say that it's just American weakness. It may be playing their hand badly. Obviously, they've got a huge disadvantage with Biden, but it's not clear whether or not he's actually even trying to exert influence over the implementation of policy. I'm pretty sure there's kind of like forces behind the scene, whether you believe it's a committee of individuals or Obama governing from the basement, like he joked about for his theoretical third term. But there's clearly a direction the United States has chosen that is not going well for them in pretty much every single regard. If we have time, we can briefly touch upon Ukraine as well, because there's been quite a lot of developments there. But I think really that the Chinese are playing their hand extraordinarily skillfully, and I think that the current foreign minister and the director of foreign affairs, they're both excellent. Xi Jinping now has, like total control over the Chinese Communist Party. So he clearly has a vision of what he wants to achieve. And at this point, we're really seeing it not being discussed in theory, but being implemented as fast as they can possibly, do.
Interesting. So there is obviously an urgency there that we haven't seen before, and this is what we continually and repeatedly report here. Is just the simple pace. Look, let's move along and hit the big story, I suppose, from last week, which was none other than Tucker Carlson. I mean, he was forced to leave the Fox News screens. He still has a contract, I understand. So technically, he hasn't left the employment yet. Is that right?
That's certainly what seems to be the case. That he wasn't kind of, even though he was taken off air at relatively short notice, that and he's been kind of like excluded from the premises, that he still has an outstanding contract, and now the lawyers are arguing, as was the case with Cuomo and Lemon and Stelter, about the buyout terms of his contract. There's been some speculation that they may just keep on paying him through the end of 2024, in effect to silence him during the presidential election. But on the other hand, he may have all kinds of dirt that they don't want thrown about, and they're going to want him to sign a non-disclosure agreement with some kind of lump sum payout. But allegedly he was on 20 million a year, which was quite a lot of money. So to sit and do nothing for 30 million on one hand might appear attractive. There are rumors that he's now being called to run for political office. There's plenty of time in order to have him registered before the primaries start next year. And obviously he has the advantage of being extremely well known. The share price went down about 5%, though I suspect on Monday it's going to go down a lot more, because he put out just a short 2-minute video on Twitter that got like 65 million views in a day or so. And what has happened is not only has his time slot that he was on, which was I think 8 p.m. New York time, been completely gutted of its viewership, but interestingly enough, the shows were either side of it that had people tuning in early or staying late, their viewership is halved as well. So it just goes to show how the entire organization was literally relying upon him as a crutch. And I suspect that it's going to go down overall quite a lot more, particularly if he goes into some other kind of news forum rather than running for election. Because it's possible that he could announce now and suddenly ally himself with Trump, or he might wait until the end of the year. There's no reason why he should necessarily, if he's only considering being a vice president candidate rather than a full presidential candidate, that he would have to declare himself any sooner than that.
It's absolutely fascinating. The speeches that he's giving, these podcasts that you could almost do just off the cuff, are extraordinary. His ability to reason and to make sense of the craziness that is going on is very, very endearing, and it provides a lot of confidence, because where Trump lacks in his ability to be eloquent, Tucker Carlson makes up for it in spades. Regardless of what his opponents say, he just makes sense, and 65 million views in a matter of a few days is truly astonishing. Nobody gets those types of ratings on any format today.
When you think about how Trump would be expected to perform against Biden in a debate, and then Tucker Carlson against Kamala Harris in a debate, I mean, those would just be like, total victories one would anticipate for the Republican candidate in both circumstances. But what is interesting, though, is both the Republican National Committee and the Democrat National Election Committee are both indicating that they're not going to have primary debates.
How interesting.
Yeah. So they don't want DeSantis, who obviously is a trained lawyer and Navy intelligence officer, grilling Trump. And they don't want RFK Jr. grilling Biden. So they've just said, we're not going to do any debates.
What a world. And who knows, they might not even go with a presidential debate. They might just decide that debating is out, and that would cement the idea that the narrative is entirely controlled, and we'll have to watch this space. Now, in terms of the news behind the news, and this is the real news that Simon is a specialist at, and he's getting all sorts of accolades around the world. I know that I said you were renowned, but another commentator has called you a legend, Simon.
Well, I'm one of several very skilled political analysts, so I definitely wouldn't wish to diminish my peer group too aggressively.
Oh, well, it's nice to know that all of you, a rising tide lifts all boats, let's say. So there's a whole bunch of legends around there that are reporting the news the way it used to be and should be. Let's talk about a Filipino president. What a fantastic name, Bongbong Marcos. He's headed over to Washington, D.C. What's going on?
So that's a fairly complicated tale. The United States had a very, very difficult relationship with his predecessor, who many people remember, particularly from Australia, was very, very hard anti-drugs, but was also, ironically, very, very pro-Japs. So that was a very strange dichotomy. But he also had quite a poor relationship, both with Trump and initially with Biden. So we've got this relatively new Philippine president who is the son of the ruler who many people who are in their, shall we say 50 plus, may remember, was run out of office in the late 80s. That was Ferdinand Marcos, who fled with his wife, who had the enormous shoe collection, Imelda, to live his sunshine years in sunny California. Well, his son has risen back to the presidency. He's allowed the Americans to have an additional 4 military bases in the Philippines, which takes it to a total of 9, same as Greece has recently done with the Americans. The Chinese are extremely unhappy about that because 2 of them are at the northernmost tip of the Philippine Islands and are the closest point for America to be able to surge reinforcements into Taiwan, that also has about 200,000 Filipino migrant workers in it. So the Chinese foreign minister went to visit him for 2 days last week, and now he's going to visit Biden for 4 days this week. He's arriving on Monday, 1st of May, our time. Bear in mind that he's kind of flying overnight and losing a day and going across the international date line. And I think that he's very much going to jump into the American boat along with the South Koreans and the Japanese. So we'll then have to see what China does in terms of trade, because there is quite a lot of trade with the Philippines. There's also a lot of Philippine migrant workers in Hong Kong, and it's possible that those would not get their work permits and no future work permits issued. So it's a complicated situation. We have talked about these issues before, about how China extended the opportunity to participate in the Greater Eurasian Partnership in the New Era to South Korea and Japan, and they just said, look, you don't have to renounce your defense treaties with America, or condemn Joe Biden as a invalid or whatever. You've just got to demonstrate the phrase that Macron's using of strategic autonomy or strategic independence. But both of those countries have literally tripled down. They're all in on supporting Ukraine, they're all in on sanctions against Russia, and they're all in on defense cooperation with the United States. So it's an absolute, flat out, unequivocal no to the Chinese. And interestingly enough, the response that has come so far against the Japanese, but not yet against the South Koreans, is the Chinese have now started referring to the Okinawa prefecture, where there's a great number of American military bases, as the Ryukyu Islands, which is what they were named pre-1945, and theoretically are actually independent. So in much the same way that Japan is suggesting that Taiwan should be independent of China, then the Chinese are suggesting that Okinawa should be independent of Japan. Then they wouldn't be bound by the Japanese pacifist constitution, but they also wouldn't be bound by the Japanese government agreements to host American military bases. So then the people of Okinawa could kick out the Americans.
Interesting.
So, and that's just happened in the last few days.
Wow. Now, we reported in a previous show that Secretary Newland of the United States had headed over to Mongolia, and that was not received very well by China. And of course, now it's met with a consequence. Can you explain what's going on?
Well, there's two consequences. One, the foreign minister of Mongolia has been summoned to Beijing, and she's literally arriving kind of like now, your time, so Monday, Australia time. She's going to be there for May 1st, which is the International Labour Day, and May 2nd. Pretty sure she's going to get a stern talking to, since Victoria Newland does seem to be the kiss of death in terms of governing parties. When she goes to Sudan, everything kicked off within about 3 weeks. Obviously, she was instrumental in the revolution in Ukraine as well. And so the other issue that's occurred is both the CENTCOM commander, who recently went to Turkmenistan, and Donald Lu, who was the ambassador to Pakistan, but has now been made the kind of assistant secretary of state responsible for all the Central Asian countries, and also Secretary Blinken. They've all visited what are called the C5 countries. That's Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, which I can't say when I'm really drunk. And so they've really been trying to pry those away from Russia and make them more American aligned. And people may remember that the Americans actually had bases in Uzbekistan for a period of years when they were active in Afghanistan. Now, obviously, the Americans are out of Afghanistan. There's no reason why they should be in those other countries. Russia's been acting as a peacekeeper between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, who have constant border disputes. And they also intervened um, early on in the COVID situation in 2022 to save the government of Kazakhstan, who have still been very independent. You would think they would have been quite grateful for having their necks literally saved by the Russian special forces, but they've still been flirting quite aggressively with the Americans. So the Chinese have just decided, right, all of that is just way too uncomfortable, and they've now agreed, as a great diplomatic triumph for the new Chinese foreign minister, a series of agreements with all of those five countries. And there's going to be a meeting of the heads of government soon, the presidents of all those countries, to just sign the kind of dotted line on all these agreements, which is a significant shift in the sphere of influence. So Russia is essentially losing or relinquishing some of its influence in nations that are part of the former Soviet Union and are now known as the near abroad, and indeed are in the current Commonwealth of Independent States. So the Chinese influence is very much shifting over that region. So it is a kind of like dynamic equilibrium shift from kind of like Russia right up to the Chinese border to the Chinese now pushing through those countries right up to the Russian border. And one wonders, to be honest, even though in theory they're all friends and they're all members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and all that kind of stuff, whether or not Russia is really happy about that. It is a change, but obviously at the moment they're just completely distracted with Ukraine and trying to negotiate with the Indians and the Iranians. So I think China has taken advantage of this moment because they were very concerned that a power vacuum was forming, and it appeared like as though the Americans were about to take advantage of that. So that really has been a great diplomatic success for the Chinese, and that occurred on Thursday.
It's amazing when you look at the map that we've got on the screen right now, just to get a feeling, a picture of, for many of us in the West, it's just all a big blur. But when you see what we can determine as the Stan countries pressing there on Iran and realizing how this ties into the international north-south transport corridor and its importance, that America is meddling with these Stan countries to try and put pressure back. You can see where China is really trying to hold it all together at the same time
So
and move the great Eurasian partnership along.
the other really big announcement was that so far, um, China has invested about $30 billion into Pakistan over the last 10 years, and they've just announced that they're going to build a railroad diagonally across Pakistan from the northeast corner to the southwest corner port of Gwadar. And that's going to be a $58 billion project. And to put that in context, that is the largest single Belt and Road Initiative project that China has done anywhere in the world. So it's a huge deal, and it's almost 1,700 mile railroad that will then be able to connect across the border into the port of Chabahar and then continue across Iran and then into Turkey for Europe. So what the Chinese are trying to do is they're trying to establish not just one railroad to Europe, but to have, well, it's potentially going to be four parallel routes, so that if there's an incredibly bad winter, then the most northern one could be disrupted by snow. If they're going through Pakistan, then they could be attacked by the Baluchistan independence people or some of the groups out of Afghanistan. If they're going through Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, then that's vulnerable to action in Azerbaijan. And then there's the one that basically goes through Mongolia, then into Kazakhstan, and then across the Caucasus into Central Europe. So each one of them has potential vulnerabilities, but they're figuring that hopefully no more than two out of the four would ever go down at one point. And they also think that they're less vulnerable than some of the maritime choke points like the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal and the Hormuz Straits and the Straits of Malacca in between Singapore and Indonesia. So they're very much trying to future-proof their trade routes with the European Union, because they're hoping that they'll still be able to get this what's called the CIA, the China Investment Act, that's been on hold because there's all this debate about decoupling or de-risking under pressure from the Americans between the Europeans and the Chinese. But the Chinese are hoping that even if there's some element of de-risking so that the European Union isn't overly reliant upon China, that they'll still maintain strong trade connections, and that then that logistic route times four, albeit that a lot of railways have got to be built over the next 5 years, that will really start reaping enormous dividends. But if you're investing $58 billion in a country as volatile, I mean, you've got real political issues going on in Pakistan. You have to be looking on a 20, 50, 100-year basis there. Because, there could be a revolution or a military coup in a week in Pakistan. And so you don't just cough up $58 billion and just go, well, I'll take a risk. You've got to have a very, very high degree of confidence that one way or another, you're going to get a decent return on your investment once it's completed.
Oh, absolutely. And what's powerful about all of this is that we are looking at a landmass that was largely the former Soviet Union, the USSR, these countries that were involved there years ago. And now, of course, it's now moving into a new China hegemon, if you will. Now, the reason I wanted to just circle around that was that for our Australian viewers, and most of our audience here, 75-80% of it is Australian, would have noticed today, Simon, on our mainstream Monday morning news that some 830 odd businesses collapsed in Australia in March. We're now in May. In March, 830 odd businesses, which is astonishing given that it's a small country and have been very heavily subsidised during COVID. And they had a particular restaurateur on, and he'd owned some 15 restaurants and was explaining that it was getting more and more difficult, and that the spring back, the bounce back that they were expecting post-COVID simply hasn't come. And that's mainly because of interest rates going up, and the disposable income has dropped immensely in Australia. But my point around that is this, and I made the point to my wife, that we are a capitalist country, and we turned socialist by design during COVID, where the money was literally printed and handed out for people to actually stay home. Now, the bounce back has been that it's become very, very hard in this country to find employees and to keep them. Why would that be the case when everyone is desperate? Should it be that employment's easy? It certainly isn't. I've applied for jobs as an exercise and as a necessity, and don't get callbacks despite being more than qualified for particular jobs, and can't work out why it is that this anomaly is going on. So then we get into a situation that there are now calls in Australia, if it's businesses, is collapsing, for the government yet again to bail out these businesses. So we have a mentality here in Australia that the people don't really want to work in a capitalist situation and expect to be subsidised in a new socialist environment. What I'm trying to say is that we're finding that in the West, it's becoming increasingly obvious that people don't want to work the way that we used to work in the past, and sounds very conservative and very, very old school in all of it. But a capitalist system thrives on the fact that people want to contribute and be rewarded for contribution. And if you say that it doesn't work and then to replace it with a socialist system, it becomes very, very obvious that the government is meant to stand in, take over the running of said businesses, scrap the ones that don't work, and therefore prop the system up. Now, that just layers a whole new layer of bureaucracy, highly paid bureaucrats getting paid the six-figure salaries to run these businesses, and the money dries up either way. If you don't work, capitalism doesn't work, and if you don't want to work, socialism isn't going to work at all. And yet here we are, China, a communist country, embracing capitalism and thriving. To me, it seems obvious, but the West, I don't know what's going on. It seems that half the population just doesn't want to contribute anymore. Simon, have you got any thoughts on all of that?
Yes, well, I would say that part of it is a direct plan to try and roll out the universal basic income.
We'll
So that is, if you have lower labour participation rates, then that's extremely helpful in achieving that. The other thing is what Edward Dowd has done a lot of statistical analysis on. He's that chap based in Hawaii who you often see on right-wing media in the United States, saying how many people have now registered and qualified for disability benefits because they've had very severe adverse reactions to some of the medications that were promoted very heavily in Australia and the United States over the last couple of years. So that has driven millions and millions of people out of the labour force, and they're literally sitting at home disabled, even though they would wish to be working if they could. And then you've had the general trend that a lot of people found that they could homeschool. So a lot of mothers in particular decided that actually homeschooling was very, very attractive. So that reduced the female participation rate. And then a lot of other people decided that they really actually hated serving individual people face to face in the retail and kind of restaurant sector. And so they decided that if they could possibly get any kind of job working from home where they didn't have to commute an hour each way, and that was also quite attractive. And I do think that in many cities, you've still got people who are driving around with their mask on and their windows up, irrespective of any real health risk. And those people are still fairly reluctant to go into a restaurant with 200 or 300 people. So there's a lot of headwinds to go against in the service sector. That's like kind of 5 particular issues that I've just described there. And so that's the problem that you've got. On the flip side, in terms of costs of operating a business, don't think you've got 2 things. You've had, as the forerunner of the digital identity, directors of Australian companies had to provide every aspect of their life online because the government figured that if they could force the directors to do that, then the directors would force all of their employees to do that when they inevitably try and make the digital identity mandatory. So that's been a big issue. A lot of people have decided, I don't want to do that amount of privacy violations just to be allowed to run a business. And they've literally gone from being business owners to being employees of other businesses. So that's part of the reason why a lot of businesses have closed down. The other reason is, of course, the energy costs. You know, not only have people had their disposable income reduced because their mortgage and monthly payments have gone up, but their electricity and gas bills have gone up hugely. And so exactly like you said, people are now having to get store brand food rather than luxury brand food, and they're having to cook at home rather than go out, and they have to sit and watch Netflix rather than going to the big screen cinema. And so all of those are once again driving the ultimate goal of the International Energy Agency and the WEF for people to work at home as much as possible and to minimize their carbon footprint. But that doesn't benefit the service sector very well.
Certainly doesn't. I tell you what, if you've even tried to go to the cinema lately, my local cinema has two films playing at a time and one international subtitled film, like a Tamil film or something like that, in a major Hoyts entertainment that used to have 6 or 8 films playing at once. I don't know what's happened to the entire cinema industry. Hollywood, I don't know where it's gone in all of this.
Well, Hollywood is still making movies. A lot of them go very quickly onto pay-per-view, though, whether it's Amazon or Netflix or Hulu or something else like that. But China's still knocking out plenty of movies as well. That they've just put out one, which is supposed to be the Chinese version of Top Gun.
Yeah.
Which I haven't seen yet, not with any subtitles anyway.
Wow.
But that'll be interesting to see. Supposedly, that's got very strong reviews, but it's a huge kind of like shift in the functioning of the Australian economy. And as they shut down, what is it, Littlewood, that power plant that the Australian government seems to
the Liddell, power plant has now closed. Yeah. Amazing.
So, rates are going to go up more on that. We've got a 5-year gap between, that reliable source of power going and intermittent sources being put in place, supposedly with giant batteries to try and store the solar during the day and pump it out during the night and stuff. But you lose an enormous amount of power, kind of like converting that solar feed into the right kind of input for the battery. And then when you kind of like take the power out and transform it again, you're talking about 50% power losses and inefficiency each time you do that. So you go from like 100% to 25% before it's even into your appliance. It seems absurd. I mean, I was looking today, bear in mind that the national grid is intended to be completely degasified by 2035. So no natural gas at all in Britain. So you won't have to run a gas stove, can't have a gas boiler for hot water.
So that's the end of every Asian restaurant that was ever created in 2035 in Europe.
No more. Woks will be banned as well, right? And today at noon UK time, so when I woke up in Florida, the UK, their power source was 46% natural gas.
Wow.
And yet in 12 years, that's going to be zero every single day.
Simon, voting is now open for overseas residents in Turkey. What's the latest in terms of polling?
So we've had some quite dramatic news today. A newspaper poll came out indicating that the leader of the combined opposition parties was 23% ahead of the current Turkish president. That was an enormous shock. The previous polls had shown him 4 or 5% ahead. So that has huge ramifications for NATO, for Turkish-Russian relations, and for the situation in Syria as well. The polling for Turkish overseas residents who are mainly in Germany and Austria has already started, but the domestic first round for the presidential election, which would be the last round if one person got over 50%, is on the 14th of May. And then if nobody gets over 50%, then the second round will be on the 28th of May, just 2 weeks later. But if that poll were to be correct, then the opposition leader would actually win in the first round. Some newspapers have actually started speculating as to whether or not Erdogan would go to the Constitutional Court and have the election result thrown out, as he did once before in the mayoral elections for Ankara and for Istanbul. But in both of those two incidences, even though he persuaded the court that there had been irregularities and got reruns ordered, he lost even worse on both of those subsequent do-overs because people were so annoyed that he tried to play some shenanigans. So it seems less likely that he would be inclined to try that route this time. But you have to remember, he's been in power for 20 years. And so he's got whole generations of civil servants that have been like handpicked and put into positions of power. So it's going to be very, very difficult for a fractured grouping of opposition parties to actually come over and effectively take control of the reins of power in the state of Turkey.
That's very, very interesting. So, but no sympathy though for Erdogan getting sick on television just last week, if the poll numbers have gone against him.
Yeah, well, maybe that just showed him that, even though his opposition candidate is even older than him, that he himself wasn't some kind of superhuman character like Putin, who's often been shown with kind of like bears and fishing and shooting and horseback riding. And so, part of the mystique and the cult of personality may have been broken just by that simple 2 or 3 day absence due to relatively simple illness. But I think in part a lot of it is people were unhappy about the response to the earthquakes, and it takes a certain amount of courage to go against a body that's been in power and very dominant for 20 years. But sometimes it's just feeding off other people's courage. So it may be that there's now a groundswell of opposition that's being seen. But we thought that was going to transpire today in the important elections in Paraguay that had implications for the recognition of Taiwan or not. And certainly from the initial poll results that are coming out, there appears quite incredibly to have been a swing from the opposition party leading by kind of +3 or 4 to suddenly losing by 17. So that's like more than the 20% swing. So whether or not these things are manipulated or whether or not the newspaper polls are just incredibly unreliable, I'm not in a position to determine that reliably in relation to Paraguay and Turkey, but certainly very, very numerically significant changes, either on the day of the election or 2 weeks before the election.
Yeah, look, it's very, very interesting, isn't it? And the Paraguayan results appear that the Conservatives will hold power there. But of course, it's just the turnaround that we're seeing is truly extraordinary. And it doesn't make sense that 20% of a country can just switch its allegiances all overnight. And so many people becoming increasingly frustrated with the electoral system all around the world. And none more than what happened with Tucker and Fox and the Dominion debacle, as we see. I'd never seen ever that Rupert Murdoch would just hand over 800 million US just like that. It's extraordinary. Now, before we wrap up, I just want to get your thoughts on what's going on with Iranian politician Raisi heading to see President Assad in Syria. What's going on? And also with Jordan having a meeting regarding Syrian interests as well.
So there's almost like every time we speak, lots going on with Iran. In particular, 3 things. One, they've announced with the Saudis that the embassies, but for both countries and both the consulates and the flights will all be operating by the end of next week. So by May the 6th or 7th. So that's within their intended time scale. Then the president of Iran is going to meet the president of Syria on Wednesday. This will be the first time that a senior Iranian official has gone to Syria since 2011. And they are actually intended to sign a significant number of cooperation agreements. And the president of Iraq has just been in Iran visiting the president there and the Ayatollah Khamenei. The Ayatollah Khamenei told him that at this point there should not be one single American in the nation of Iraq. So Iran does seem to be taking advantage of a bit of goodwill from the Arab League countries and is really exerting its presence both in Iraq and also in Syria, where there are small numbers of American troops in both countries, who frankly at this point are very, very vulnerable. The Arab League is still dealing with three holdouts, in particular Qatar and Egypt, who aren't particularly happy about Syria being readmitted as a full member of the Arab League. So they had a meeting in Jeddah to discuss that. That wasn't fully resolved, and they're now going to have another meeting in Jordan with the Syrians, the Iraqis, and the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Saudis, and not in this case the Russians or the Iranians. And they're going to try and see if it's possible to bring Syria back in the month of May. So literally in a few days. And that the Americans are very, very much against that. And traditionally, the Jordanians and the Egyptians have followed American wishes. So if those two countries and the Qataris all back down to Iranian and Saudi pressure to readmit Syria, then once again, that's going to be reflective of another very, very significant loss of prestige and soft power for the United States. They effectively will have had, three people who currently are no votes all go to being abstaining votes. So that would be Egypt, Qatar, and Jordan.
Okay, very, very interesting. The developments keep going. But the international north-south transport corridor running through Iran makes Iran now a huge power player in all of this. It just seems that the value of land, if nothing else in Iran, must skyrocket with this huge development that's been some 25 years or so in the making. It's just astonishing why we always refer to Iran in these news shows, Simon. And as we constantly joke about, everything, everywhere, all at once seems to be the apt title for this country.
It's definitely a lot of moving pieces in Iran. They've still got big problems in terms of what currencies to deal in relation to the sanctions. They're trying to work that out with the Indians and the UAE and the Russians to completely de-dollarize their economy. And interestingly enough, President Assad of Syria came out today and made a statement that he is keen to completely de-dollarize the Syrian economy. And that has, like Lebanon and Argentina, very much been seen as a store of value. People have always wanted to convert their local currency into dollars to have a good reserve as a kind of safety net. And it's not so much that they're going to ban the dollar, but they're going to tell people to hold Chinese yuan or UAE dirham instead.
Goodness me, it's all happening, isn't it? Look, it's been terrific to be able to catch up and get the news from all over the weekend. Before you go, and I know you've got to, what are you looking forward to this week as the big developments coming up?
See what happens with President Marcos. See what happens with the Mongolian foreign minister. See how things go between Raisi and Assad. What happens tomorrow in Jordan. So that's kind of like four immediate events, and then there's still negotiations going on about the potential for Turkey to withdraw from northern Syria. If they do, which is what the opposition leader has indicated, then that will put enormous pressure on the Americans essentially to flee. And I suspect when they leave Syria, there'll then be a lot of pressure upon them to leave Iraq. So that'll be a sea change for those two countries. The Iraqis have been very keen to have the Americans out for many, many years now. But one really wonders whether or not we may actually see a true domino theory effect, which was their whole argument for persisting in Vietnam. If they're kicked out of Syria and they're kicked out of Iraq, Will they then be kicked out of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Qatar and Kuwait and Jordan and Egypt? And will there just be this incredible spiral of repulsion of the Americans, which is exactly what the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese all want to see, so that they don't have any possible interference on not only the movement of their goods and forces through Iran, but also any interference with their shipping in the Persian Gulf. So those are longer term schemes, but in exactly the same way that the French fell after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Immediately, the revolution in Algeria started. It took 8 years until 1962, but eventually the French were then expelled from Algeria, which at the time was considered a part of France in much the same way that Crimea is currently considered to be a part of Russia. So if we could see that kind of sequence of events pick up pace, then that indeed would, be part of 50,000 American troops being relocated from the Middle East, which in his announcement speech, RFK Jr. indicated that he already was inclined to close many bases around the world and bring Americans home.
So much going on. It's been brilliant once again to get your attention for the full hour and update all of us here in Australia on momentous events that are happening all around Simon, around the world. It's truly astonishing at the rate of knots and the ability for China to, with the Middle East and South America, to restructure planet Earth away from the United States. And as we talked about earlier, whether it's the weakness of the US or just the lack of interest, we watch on as the world strangely is being divided into a unipolar version and a multipolar version, US versus China. Truly amazing. Thanks again, Simon. It's been brilliant to have you on the show. And for everyone else watching, thank you for your continued support. And I look forward to seeing you all on the next edition of World Series News.